Welcome to this explainer. Lately I've been thinking, have you noticed just how utterly exhausting modern convenience can be? We live in this era where literally everything is optimized. It's frictionless. It's available at the tap of a screen. But instead of feeling well-rested and sharp, a massive portion of us are experiencing this early onset cognitive exhaustion and completely scattered attention. Well, today, we're looking at a fascinating research brief that flips our entire understanding of leisure completely on its head. Because, as it turns out, the very friction and frustration we are desperately trying to engineer out of our daily lives, those might be the exact biological ingredients our brains actually need to survive.
Now, you've probably seen all those ads for digital brain training, right? The commercial market is aggressively pushing these passive, automated mobile apps. They promise that if you just tap the right colorful shapes for, say, 5 minutes a day, you're going to preserve your cognitive function. But look at the empirical clinical data, and it paints a very different picture. Those apps, they largely fail to provide any generalized, real-world intellectual protection. They just create these localized loops of task-specific optimization. Basically, you get really good at the game, but that's about it. Now compare that to what researchers are playfully calling grandma and grandpa hobbies. Think about untangling incredibly complex yarn patterns or, rebuilding a greasy carburetor without a manual. These are highly complex, tactile, and deeply frustrating physical activities. And guess what? They don't come with an undo button.
Okay, let's dive into this. Is your perfectly curated, relaxing evening routine actually causing your brain to atrophy? We are caught in this profound behavioral divergence right now. Our phones and our digital systems are increasingly doing all the heavy cognitive lifting for us. And because our workdays are so intensely digitally demanding, we naturally just gravitate toward passive relaxation in the evenings. We scroll, we watch, we totally zone out. But here's the catch. If those passive routines dominate your downtime, you aren't actually resting your brain. You are starving it of the structural resistance it desperately needs to stay healthy.
Section 1. The Science of Frustration and Building Structural Neural Buffers.
So to really understand this, we need to shift how we look at mental effort. Instead of relying on entertainment or repetitive tasks that our nervous system just quickly automates, the core science shows we actually need to put the brain under sustained environmental and intellectual pressure. True cognitive resilience is literally built in the crucible of a challenge. And this brings us to a foundational concept, cognitive reserve theory. I want you to think of your brain like a massive, bustling highway system. Over time, thanks to normal aging or localized cell death, some of those roads are naturally going to experience wear and tear. You might even get some full-blown road closures. Well, cognitive reserve theory is the neurological framework showing that through a lifetime of continuous complex learning, you build a robust network of alternative, overlapping neural connections. It's essentially a vast system of side streets and detours. So when structural damage does happen, a brain with high cognitive reserve just naturally reroutes the traffic, effectively detouring right around the decay.
Let's break down the biological pathway here to see how this actually works in practice. Step 1, you apply sustained environmental pressure. And I don't mean tapping a glowing screen. I mean doing multi-sensory fieldwork or physically tearing apart an old engine. Step 2, you inevitably encounter complex, tactile frustration. You put a part in backward or your knitting pattern gets hopelessly tangled. Now pay attention to that physical frustration because it is absolutely key. It leads directly to step 3, generating neuroplastic adaptation. Because of that friction, your brain is forced to physically restructure itself to solve the three-dimensional problem sitting right in front of you. Which ultimately leads us to step 4, successfully creating those vital detours required to bypass neural decay. So the difficulty? It's not a bug in the hobby. The difficulty is the entire point.
Moving on to Section 2, the power of analog play and the Pamukkale standoff. Have you ever heard of the Pamukkale standoff? It perfectly represents the mental gridlock we face in what's known as modern ecosystem exhaustion. It's this incredibly tense standoff between our deep biological need to heal and an environment that absolutely refuses to let us. Think about the water we're swimming in every single day. We're driven by overlapping vocal demands from every possible direction. We face aggressive transaction pressures where everyone wants a piece of your time or your money. Add in high-sensory environmental noise, and it all leads to an immediate cognitive overload of our executive network. So when you try to logically assert boundaries or calculate your value right in the middle of all that chaotic noise, it's a completely hollow victory. Even if you somehow win the argument, the sheer act of fighting the noise just consumes your vital metabolic reserves.
And this brilliantly illustrates why just taking a deep breath at your desk doesn't really work. The brain simply cannot heal its pathways while it is actively fighting a loud, transactional market. It requires an entirely different container. Survival requires a clean, structural pivot away from the noise and into a dedicated environment of deliberate silence and internal isolation. You literally have to physically and cognitively step off the battlefield.
The mechanism for that clean pivot is what the research calls combinatory play. Basically, this is the practice of deliberately engaging in a highly challenging, nonverbal or artistic task. We're talking about playing an instrument, throwing pottery, doing some heavy manual labor, and because the task is nonverbal and tactile, it completely relieves the focal stress on your conscious executive mind. It acts as this necessary structural pivot, almost like a pressure release valve for your executive function. It safely re-regulates your brain's baseline operational rhythm while totally allowing your subconscious to quietly process and resolve complex structural problems in the background. It's kind of amazing.
Section 3. The Hustle Culture Trap, and when hobbies become toxic.
All right, here is where we hit our first massive twist. What happens when we try to monetize these hobbies? Does turning your passion into a side hustle fundamentally destroy its neurological benefits? I want you to think about the extreme friction that occurs the exact moment you take an enriching hobby and turn it into a commercial venture. The very second your analog play is linked to your financial survival, or an Etsy storefront, or even the need for external social media validation, the entire dynamic flips. It is no longer a safe container away from the transactional market. It has actually become the transactional market.
So the crucial point is right here in the biology. When a hobby becomes a hustle, it introduces systemic stress. And this leads to something called cortisol-induced hippocampal impairment. Now, I know that sounds super complex, but basically, chronic performance stress triggers your adrenal glands to secrete prolonged levels of cortisol. And that cortisol, it acts almost like a weed killer in your brain. It actively prunes away healthy connections and impairs neurogenesis right within your primary memory systems. So hustle culture literally transforms voluntary protective challenges into toxic, cortisol-driven obligations that actively harm your memory. Let that sink in for a second.
Let's look at Section 4, Escaping the Mastery Trap, and the danger of getting too good.
So let's say you successfully avoid the hustle culture trap, right? You keep your hobby entirely free of external performance metrics, and you never monetize it. You're safe, right? Well, actually, scratch that. Here is our second counterintuitive twist. We are so culturally conditioned to pursue mastery, but getting too good is actually a cognitive dead end. It's called the mastery trap. This happens when you achieve total efficiency at a specific repetitive task. The moment you become a master, a once challenging exercise just transforms into an automatic routine. And our nervous systems are incredible at optimizing. So once it figures out the pattern, your systemic cognitive load completely drops to zero. If you simply repeat what you are already comfortable doing, you effectively halt all further neuroplastic adaptation.
Which leaves us walking this vital, fascinating tightrope. How do you systematically design a complex hobby so it remains a source of continuous, frustrating friction, but doesn't cross the threshold into that destructive chronic stress we just talked about? Well, the secret, as it turns out, is that true cognitive protection requires you to actively and intentionally remain a clumsy beginner. You literally have to keep changing the parameters, learning totally new techniques, and actively seeking out the frustration of not knowing exactly what you are doing.
And finally, Section 5. The ultimate human rebellion and preserving the mind. Let's move to and see how this builds over time, really zooming out to the existential stakes here. Because we aren't just talking about arts and crafts anymore. Look at the timeline. Just a few decades ago, in the past, our daily lives were heavily defined by analog survival and constant physical problem solving. Our brains were just naturally challenged by our environment. Cut to the present, today, and digital applications are actively automating our cognitive processing. I mean, our phones remember our schedules, they navigate our streets, they even spell-check our thoughts. But look at the future. We are rapidly accelerating toward a coming era of total AI automation. We're looking at a world that threatens to completely eliminate our biological survival-driven need to think, to create, or to physically solve problems at all.
Which brings us to our final, really provocative thought for this explainer. If the whole world is being engineered to remove all cognitive friction, then choosing to step into the garage or the studio to genuinely struggle with your own two hands is no longer just some quaint pastime. So is remaining a frustrated beginner in an analog hobby just mere nostalgia? Or does it become the final, definitive act of rebellion required to preserve the very architecture of the human mind? Definitely something to think about the next time you feel the sudden urge to completely optimize your evening.
Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really hope this completely changes how you look at the hidden power of a little frustration.